Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a question that has haunted the lore of Warhammer 40,000 for decades. A question so simple that it should have a simple answer, and yet it does not. Who is Alpharius? And I want you to sit with that question for a moment before we go any further. Really sit with it. Because in most cases, when you ask that about a Primarch, you get an answer. Horus was the beloved firstborn, favored son of the Emperor, the bright golden warrior who fell from grace and dragged the galaxy to war with him. Gilliman was the bureaucrat king, the architect of the Imperium's bones. Magnus was the scholar who reached too far and burned everything he loved. Sanguinius was the angel who knew he was going to die and walked toward death anyway. You can summarize most of the Primarchs in a sentence or two, at least in broad strokes. But Alpharius, the very sources that try to tell you who he is, warn you not to trust what they're saying. The very book written from his own perspective opens with the sentence, "I am Alpharius, this is a lie." That is where we begin. That is the foundation of this entire story. A Primarch who confesses his own unreliability before he's even properly introduced himself. Welcome to the deep waters of the Alpha Legion. If something feels like solid ground down here, keep your eyes open. It isn't. Section 1. The name that means nothing and everything. Let's begin with the surface layer. At the broadest possible overview of who Alpharius is, and even here at the most fundamental level, things start to fracture. Alpharius Omegon is the designation given to the Primarch of the 20th Legion of Space Marines, the Alpha Legion, created by the Emperor of Mankind during the age of the Imperium's founding. He is referred to as the last Primarch because, according to the most commonly accepted version of events, he was the final of the Emperor's 20 sons to be rediscovered after all of them were scattered across the galaxy by the Chaos Gods when they were still infants. He is also referred to as the Aleph Null, the Hydra, the Threefold Serpent, and the Final Configuration. These are not just dramatic titles. Each of those names contains an entire philosophy of war, of deception, of what one being can mean to the galaxy when that being refuses to be defined, refuses to be pinned down, but refuses to be known. The Alpha Legion is, to put it plainly, the strangest of all the Space Marine legions. Not because they worship chaos with the most fervor, though many of them eventually did. Not because they have the most horrifying mutations or the most powerful demon princes, but because of something quieter and more unsettling. Because after 10,000 years, nobody is entirely sure whose side they are on, and that includes, by most accounts, themselves. No, but to understand the mystery, you need to understand the man, or the men, because that is the great secret at the center of everything, the one that once you learn it, makes all the pieces start to move in ways you weren't expecting. Alpharius Omegon is not one person. He is two. Twin Primarchs, identical in every physical respect, who shared something that the warp and the flesh of gene-crafted demigods seem to conspire to produce against all expectation. One soul, split into two bodies, or two consciousnesses so deeply intertwined that they moved as one, thought as one, and eventually came to be essentially indistinguishable from one another. The public face was Alpharius. The hidden face was Omegon. And the reason this matters, the reason this changes everything about how we understand the story that follows, is that the question of who Alpharius is cannot be separated from the question of where he is, because with two identical beings capable of swapping roles at will, every account of Alpharius doing something might actually be an account of Omegon doing that thing while wearing his brother's name like a second skin. Every death attributed to one of them might be the death of the wrong one, or neither of them at all. The Alpha Legion's own warriors perpetuated this confusion intentionally. Across campaigns and battlefields spanning centuries, Alpha Legionaries would announce themselves as Alpharius. All of them. The name was not a name. It was a statement of philosophy. A declaration that within this legion, individuality was not the source of strength. The collective was. The idea was. The Hydra could not be beheaded because every soldier was the head. The mythological image the Legion adopted as their symbol was the Hydra, that ancient creature of legend that regrows 2 heads for every one you cut off. You destroy 1 cell, 1 warband, 1 operative, and somewhere else in the galaxy, 3 more have already taken root. Yeah, you think you know where they are because you've been watching 1 visible element while 6 invisible ones have been reshaping your world around you. Now, with all of that said, let us start at the beginning. Or rather, let us start at what might be the beginning. Because with Alpharius, even the start of the story is contested. Chapter Section 2, The Ghost Legion, Before the World Knew Their Name. One of the most fascinating and underappreciated aspects of the Alpha Legion's history is the period before they were officially known as the Alpha Legion. The long years when they existed as little more than a rumor, a shadow that other Imperial forces would glimpse at the edges of operations, never quite understanding what they were looking at. Before Alpharius officially took command of the 20th Legion, those Space Marines existed under a different designation entirely. They were called the Ghost Legion, and that name tells you everything you need to know about what they were built to do and what kind of existence they led in those formative years. The Ghost Legion operated in near total secrecy. They were the Emperor's scalpel, used for missions too delicate, too morally complicated, or too sensitive to be conducted by the more visible legions who had public faces and public heroes. You should think about what that means in practical terms. The Great Crusade was an enormous, galaxy-spanning military operation. Tens of thousands of Space Marines spread across thousands of fleets, conducting military compliance operations against human worlds that had drifted into isolation, superstition, or outright alien control. It was the largest and most complex military undertaking in human history. And yet, running alongside it, woven into its fabric at the edges, was a parallel operation that almost nobody knew about. The Ghost Legion did the work that couldn't be acknowledged. Assassinations of Imperial figures who had gone too far or knew too much. Sabotage operations against forces that the official crusade hadn't reached yet. Intelligence gathering so deep and so patient that the operatives had been planted years or decades before the information they were gathering would ever be used. The Ghost Legion was not composed of only Space Marines either. This is one of the earliest signs of what would come to define the Alpha Legion's entire approach to warfare. From the very beginning, they integrated mortal human operatives into their operations at a level that was completely unprecedented among the Legiones Astartes. These men and women, called Sparatoi, were trained to work alongside the Legion's warriors as equals, given the best equipment available, drilled in infiltration and intelligence work, and trusted with missions that other legions would never have assigned to unaugmented humans. This matters because it reveals something profound about Alpharius's philosophy before we even meet Alpharius. The Ghost Legion believed that the measure of a force was not the individual power of its warriors. Any Space Marine was a near unstoppable engine of destruction in direct combat. That wasn't special. That wasn't an advantage. Or what was special was the ability to shape the battlefield before it became a battlefield. To win before the killing started. To make the enemy do half the work for you without ever knowing they were doing it. In those early decades of the Great Crusade, rumors reached other legions about this shadowy force. References to unknown Astartes in non-standard markings appearing at critical moments in campaigns. Reports of enemy resistance mysteriously collapsing before a battle began, suggesting that someone had been at work behind the lines weeks before the first shots were fired. The Dark Angels apparently had some awareness of the Ghost Legion's existence, though the details were vague. Even the Lion L. Johnson, who was not a Primarch given to fantasy or rumor-mongering, had heard whispers of what some called a 21st Legion, a force that existed in the margins. Think about what that means from a pure historical perspective. We have 20 Primarchs on record, 18 whose stories we know with some degree of certainty, 2 whose records were deliberately erased by the Emperor for reasons that remain one of the darkest mysteries in all of 40K lore. And then there is Alpharius, who represents a third category entirely. A Primarch who existed, but whose existence was kept hidden even from his own brothers. Not erased, not destroyed, hidden, deliberately concealed so that his unique utility could be preserved. There is a version of events, untold by Alpharius himself and therefore immediately suspect, that places him as not just an early discovered Primarch, but the very first one the Emperor found. According to this account, while Horus was being publicly celebrated as the discovered first son of the Emperor, Alpharius had already been found, already been brought to terror, already been trained by Malcador the Sigillite. The Emperor's reasons for keeping him secret are left somewhat ambiguous, but the implication is clear. And Alpharius was useful precisely because nobody knew he existed. His anonymity was his weapon. If this version is even partially true, it reframes the entire dynamic of the Great Crusade. The other Primarchs thought they were the Emperor's instruments, and they were. But Alpharius may have been the Emperor's instrument in a deeper, more intimate sense. Not the hammer, the hand that aimed the hammer, the eye watching from the shadows to see where the blow needed to fall. Now, to be clear, Alpharius himself tells us this account is a lie. He opens his own written history with that admission. But here is the thing about the Alpha Legion. Telling you something is a lie does not mean it is a lie. It might mean it is too true to leave uncaveated. It might mean that by admitting the deception, he draws your attention away from a deeper truth. Or it might genuinely be a fabrication designed to seed confusion. The Alpha Legion's greatest weapon has never been any particular piece of hardware or tactical innovation. It has been this: the inability to determine what is real. The permanent state of uncertainty that settles over you when you try to study them. Every fact exists in fog. Every clear detail has a shadow behind it. But let us step into one of the more concrete accounts of how Alpharius, or the being who would eventually be known as Alpharius, came to be reunited with his twin, and came to be discovered in the manner most imperial records suggest. Section 3. The first discovery. A lie wrapped in truth. Of all the Primarch's discovery stories, Alpharius's is perhaps the most operatically absurd, not in a way that diminishes it, in a way that feels completely appropriate for who he is. Most Primarch discovery stories involve the Emperor arriving at a distant world and finding his lost son ruling as a king or a warrior or a spiritual leader. There is grandeur in those reunions, majesty, the father finding the child. Alpharius's most commonly cited discovery story involves a lunar wolves warship getting humiliated. The story goes like this. A lunar wolves cruiser was operating in a far-flung region of space, doing the work of the Crusade, when it found itself outmaneuvered and laid low by a confederation of human vessels. Not Imperial vessels, not Space Marine vessels. Ordinary human ships, no match for a Legion warship in a direct engagement, but somehow, through a combination of ambush, trickery, and what could only be described as tactical brilliance, they had crippled a vessel crewed by superhuman warriors. Horus, then the War Master of the Great Crusade, and already the most celebrated of all the Primarchs, did not take this lying down. He personally led a reprisal fleet to hunt down the impudent humans who had embarrassed his sons. What followed was not a swift and clean victory for the Lunar Wolves. It was a campaign of sustained frustration, feints, ambushes, traps, decoys, a running series of engagements in which the smaller, weaker force consistently managed to stay one step ahead of the greatest military commander in the Imperium. Not winning, not threatening Horus directly, but simply refusing to be caught or destroyed. Eventually, Horus deployed the Vengeful Spirit, his own flagship, and the weight of overwhelming firepower settled the question. But even then, one lone individual managed to board the ship and work his way through multiple layers of security to reach Horus himself in something approaching personal combat. When Horus and this warrior finally came face to face, there was that moment of recognition that Primarchs sometimes describe. The sense of blood calling to blood. The awareness that this was not just an exceptional human being, this was one of them. This was another son of the emperor. The warrior gave his name as Alpharius. Horus laughed, apparently, recognizing immediately the kind of being who was standing before him, and the two formed a bond in the months that followed, before Alpharius eventually had to meet the emperor and formally take command of the 20th Legion. By multiple accounts, Horus was among the only Primarchs that Alpharius genuinely liked, or at least trusted enough to show respect toward. The War Master understood cunning in a way that the more straightforward Primarchs did not. He appreciated it. He celebrated it. But here is where this already complicated story gets dramatically more complicated. The warrior who gave his name to Horus and said, "I am Alpharius," may not have been Alpharius at all. According to the account in Mike Brooks's 2021 novel, Alpharius, head of the Hydra, which is told in Alpharius's own voice, and therefore is, as he reminds us, not entirely to be trusted, the person standing before Horus may have been Omegon. The true Alpharius, in this version, had already been with the Emperor for years. They had planned this. They had deliberately engineered a public discovery story that would serve as cover for the twin secret, giving the galaxy a narrative it could accept, while the real Alpharius continued doing what he had always done, hiding in plain sight. Now the novel's story of Omegon's origin is worth dwelling on, because it adds yet another layer of tragedy and strangeness to the already overloaded mythology. In this account, Omegon had not been raised in a functioning human civilization or a warrior culture, or even a primitive society struggling to survive. He had been enslaved and exploited by a species called the Sloth. The Sloth are one of the more disturbing alien races in the 40K universe's wider mythology, largely because they are not combatants in the galaxy's endless wars in any conventional sense. They are collectors, psychic predators who subsist on human neural tissue and who have a talent for infiltrating human civilizations at the margins, feeding on the periphery, remaining largely invisible while harvesting the resources they need. They are ancient, patient, and deeply unsettling. Omegon, scattered in the warp like all the Primarchs, had ended up somewhere that these creatures held sway. Yet he had grown to maturity in their shadow, developing his extraordinary intellect and his capacity for deception, partly in response to the environment he found himself in. The skills that would define the Alpha Legion, the patience, the layered deception, the instinct to never be what you appear to be. These were not traits that Alpharius and Omegon brought from some grand human civilization. They were survival adaptations. They were what two extraordinary beings learned when the universe around them was fundamentally untrustworthy. Eventually, in this version, Alpharius, the actual first discovered Primarch, who had been operating in secret on Terra and learning from Malkador, found his brother. They compared notes. They made a decision. They would never fully reveal themselves. Not even to each other's faces would they be entirely honest. Because the entire galaxy had taught them that being honest about what you were meant being exploited for it. Think about what that does to a person, or what it does to two people who are essentially one person. The Emperor himself had kept Alpharius secret, had used him as an instrument while his brothers were celebrated. Omegon had been literally harvested by alien predators. Their formative experiences were defined by being used, by existing as tools in other beings' plans, was by having their nature treated as a resource rather than a selfhood. Is it any wonder they built a legion based on the principle that nobody ever gets to know who you really are? Is it any wonder they designed themselves as a weapon pointed in every direction at once, capable of doing anything, committed to nothing that could be taken from them? The reunion at Barsaver, the event in which the twin Primarchs finally came together openly, as is described in the sources, with an intimacy that is rare in the usually martial-focused history of the Great Crusade. Two beings who had each existed in isolation, each carrying the weight of their uniqueness as a burden, finally confronting the other half of themselves. They speculated about their dual existence. Had the Emperor done this deliberately? Was there intent in the fact that the warp had produced two identical Primarchs when every other scattering had produced one? Or was this an accident? Two seeds of the same genetic sequence landing in different places, and growing into beings who had converged toward the same fundamental shape from entirely different soil. They didn't know. They couldn't know. And they did the thing that they would always do when confronted with uncertainty. They made the uncertainty into a weapon. They kept the secret between them. They decided that the world would know only one of them, and which one would depend entirely on what the moment required. Section 4. One soul in two bodies. The twin secret. Let us stay with this for a moment, because the twin secret of the Alpha Legion is more profound in its implications than I think it sometimes gets credit for being. Consider what it means, from a metaphysical standpoint, for two identical beings to share what they described as one soul. In the universe of Warhammer 40,000, souls are not metaphor. They are objects. They're tangible things with mass and presence in the immaterial realm of the warp. Every living thing has one. Primarchs have enormous blazing souls that can be felt by psychers across planetary distances, that leave echoes in the warp for centuries after their deaths. The soul is the fingerprint of consciousness, the thing that makes you specifically you rather than anyone else. So when Alpharius and Omegon describe themselves as one soul in two bodies, what exactly does that mean? The most generous interpretation is that they were referring to psychological and philosophical unity, that they had converged so completely in their thinking, their values, their approach to the world, that they functioned with a degree of synchronization that made them feel like a single distributed consciousness, rather than two separate individuals. This is the interpretation that makes the least metaphysical demands and fits reasonably well with what we see in their behavior. What the more unsettling interpretation is that it might be literally true. The Emperor's genecraft was not ordinary biology. It was science pushed to the absolute limits of what matter could do, guided by a being of incalculable psychic power and intelligence. Whether by design or by accident, the Emperor may have created a Primarch who was genuinely singular in the warp, but doubled in physical reality. A soul that happened to be housed in two simultaneous bodies, experiencing existence from two simultaneous perspectives, able to compare notes because it was, in some deep sense, comparing notes with itself. This would explain some things that are otherwise difficult to explain. The ease with which they swapped identities, for instance, not just physically, because their physical appearance was identical, but psychically. Other Primarchs had a sense for each other, an awareness of brotherhood that could function over great distances. Sanguinius was known to receive visions about his brothers. Magnus's psychic sensitivity gave him awareness of emotional states across the Legion. A Primarch pretending to be a different Primarch should theoretically register wrongly to another Primarch's heightened senses. But the book Alpharius, head of the Hydra, makes the suggestion that Alpharius was uniquely difficult for his brothers to detect as a Primarch at all. That's something about his nature, whether his concealed upbringing, his warp-touch development, or the literal singular soul hypothesis meant that he registered differently. That when Rogel Dawn and Robut Guilliman both claimed to have killed Alpharius in their respective battles, part of the reason neither could be completely certain of what they had killed was that they had never been entirely certain what Alpharius was to begin with. A Primarch with no psychic signature is a Primarch who can walk undetected among his brothers. And a Primarch who is simultaneously his own twin is a Primarch who has a built-in alibi for any occasion. You killed Alpharius on Pluto. How convenient. The one who died at Escrador was also Alpharius, and the one writing this account, and the ones who will fight under that name for centuries to come. All of them are Alpharius, because all of them are. The philosophical dimension of the I am Alpharius mantra of the Legion is not just clever propaganda. It is the outward expression of a genuine metaphysical position. The Alpha Legion believed, at some level, that the individual was not the essential unit of value. The idea was, the mission was, the plan that outlasts any single body carrying it forward was. This is not chaos philosophy, interestingly. The forces of chaos in Warhammer 40K are largely characterized by exactly the opposite impulse, an obsessive amplification of individual will and individual corruption and individual glory. Whilst the World Eaters celebrated the berserk fury of the warrior, the Emperor's children worshipped the perfection of the individual sensation. Chaos is, at its most fundamental, a religion of self. The Alpha Legion's philosophy was almost its mirror image. The self was something to be managed, deployed, aimed, not elevated, not glorified. The self was a tool, and the most useful thing a self could do was exactly what the situation required. Which meant sometimes the most useful thing it could do was not exist at all. The question of whether Alpharius and Omegon were entirely at peace with this philosophy is actually something the lore grapples with, especially in the later stages of the Horus heresy. There are hints that Omegon, in particular, was not always fully aligned with his brother's decisions. During the heresy, Omegon took several actions that seem to have been undertaken without Alpharius's full knowledge or approval, in actions that, quietly, worked to undermine Horus's cause rather than advance it, allowing the White Scars to receive intelligence they needed to avoid being drawn into Horus's forces, sabotaging an Alpha Legion communications array specifically so that the White Scars' isolation from the rest of the galaxy would end, and they would learn the truth of what was happening. These were not the actions of a being who was entirely committed to the traitor cause. These were the actions of someone operating on a different set of priorities, someone who had perhaps never fully accepted the logic of the Cabal's terrible bargain. But we will come to the Cabal, because the Cabal is the key to understanding why the Alpha Legion made the choice they made, and why that choice haunts 10,000 years of history. Section 5. The Alpha Legion's way of war. How they fight. Before we move into the dark heart of the Horus heresy, I want to spend some time on the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare, because it is genuinely distinctive and genuinely illuminating of their character, and also because it explains why certain Primarchs despised Alpharius so intensely. The Alpha Legion fought a kind of war that most of their brother legions did not fully understand, not because it was technically beyond their comprehension, but because it violated certain unspoken assumptions about what war was supposed to be. The Great Crusade was, at its heart, a project of revelation. The Emperor's forces brought the light of civilization, the power of the Imperium, to worlds that had spent the age of strife in darkness and isolation. Part of the purpose of the Legiones Astartes, part of why they existed as they did, rather than as a purely covert force, was that they were supposed to be seen. They were supposed to be known. The arrival of Space Marines on a world was a statement. It said, "The Imperium is real. Yes, it is here, it has power, and you are now part of it." Alpharius rejected this entirely. The Alpha Legion's ideal campaign did not end with a triumphant compliance ceremony. Banners raised over a conquered world while the local population watched in awe. Their ideal campaign ended with the target not knowing they had been defeated until the defeat was already irreversible. By the time an Alpha Legion operation reached its conclusion, the enemy had usually done most of the work for them. Our internal divisions had been stoked into civil wars. Key figures had been replaced by Legion operatives or turned by agents who had been embedded years earlier. Supply chains had been disrupted not by direct attack, but by 100 small sabotages that together amounted to logistical collapse. The enemy was not a fortress to be stormed. The enemy was a system to be dismantled from within, bolt by bolt, until the structure fell under its own weight. The tactic they called the harrowing was the final expression of this. After all the preparation, all the infiltration, all the patient undermining, came a coordinated strike from multiple directions simultaneously. Not an assault in the traditional sense. A harrowing was a thunderclap at the end of a long storm. The enemy had been weakened, isolated, confused, and turned against itself. The harrowing simply made official what was already true, that the battle had been won weeks or months before the first shot was fired. The Alpha Legion also developed recruitment and training methods that were unlike anything else in the Legiones Astartes. Where other legions tested and trained individuals, the Alpha Legion tested squads. The entire unit had to pass or the entire unit failed. Heroic individual performance was not celebrated if it came at the expense of the group. The plan was everything. Individual glory was a distraction at best and a liability at worst. A warrior who charged ahead of the formation because the moment inspired him to greatness was not a hero in the Alpha Legion. He was a failure of discipline. This translated into a Legion culture that was, in some ways, almost democratic in its internal operations. Tactical planning sessions in the Alpha Legion were open. Any rank could speak. As a squad sergeant could challenge a strategy proposed by a Harrowmaster if he saw a flaw in it. An operative with no Astartes augmentations at all could raise a concern that might reshape an entire campaign's approach. The Alpha Legion did not confuse rank with intelligence. They were interested in ideas that worked. The Alpha Legion also had an unusually large and trusted network of mortal human operatives. These Sparatoi, these augmented and trained human agents, were an integral part of the Legion's capability rather than auxiliaries assigned to secondary duties. They could infiltrate human societies in ways that Space Marines physically could not. They could maintain covers over years and decades. They could be the forward element of a plan that wouldn't mature for a generation. This makes the Alpha Legion uniquely suited to the kind of long-game warfare that defines their post-heresy existence. A legion that trains for decades-long infiltrations and multi-generation planning doesn't stop doing that just because a civil war ends. The skill set persists, the networks persist, the patience persists. Arguably, the Alpha Legion in the 41st Millennium, scattered across the galaxy in independent warbands, is still running plans that were put in motion before any living person in the Imperium was born. Now all of this was genuinely effective. The Alpha Legion had an impressive record during the Great Crusade. They excelled at bringing recalcitrant worlds to compliance without protracted conventional sieges. They were devastating against roving alien threats that relied on the confusion of their enemies. They found and eliminated rebellion before it could take root, partly because they understood rebellion intimately, because they themselves were always, in some sense, planning for the day when the plan would change. But their methods created enemies among their own brothers. Roboute Guilliman despised Alpharius. The two Primarchs had a meeting that has become somewhat legendary for the speed with which it turned from collegial exchange to barely contained hostility. Guilliman was the supreme architect of efficient, documented, replicable military doctrine. Everything the Ultramarines did could be written down, explained, taught, and reproduced. The Codex Astartes, which Guilliman would eventually write. How was the codification of this philosophy? The idea that war could be rationalized, that best practices could be established, that excellence in military command was a function of following correct procedure rather than individual inspiration. Alpharius's philosophy was not just different from this, it was almost its direct repudiation. The Alpha Legion's methods were not replicable by just anyone. They depended on deep intelligence that took years to develop, as on human networks that could not be rapidly deployed, on a kind of patient cunning that resisted being written into a manual. And they often produced victories that looked, from the outside, like lucky coincidences, rather than the product of careful planning. You could not point to a glorious charge and say there, that is where we won. You could only look at the aftermath and note that something had happened to put the enemy in a position where they could not win. Guilliman pointed to the Ultramarines' record. Hundreds of years of documented campaigns, thousands of worlds brought to compliance, losses minimized, efficiency maximized, all of it archivable and teachable. He noted that the Alpha Legion had been in existence for far fewer years, that Alpharius could not possibly claim an equivalent legacy. What he did not know, and what the lore hints very darkly at, is that the Ghost Legion had been active for the entirety of the Great Crusade, just without official recognition. If the hidden years are counted, the Alpha Legion may have had as long or longer a history as the Ultramarines. They just didn't have the records to show for it, because recording things is not what you do when your entire identity is built on not being known. The meeting ended badly. Alpharius left believing Guilliman hated him, and Guilliman, from all accounts, was not far from exactly that. This rivalry matters enormously for what comes later, because it meant that Alpharius spent years pushing his legion harder, making their plans more complex, more elaborate, more dependent on variables falling in exactly the right way, partly in response to the criticism, partly to prove that the Ultramarines' documented tradition was not the only valid way to wage war. And there is a suggestion in the sources that this drive toward ever greater complexity, this compulsive need to prove something to Guilliman and to the other Primarchs who dismissed him, may have made the Alpha Legion more brittle in certain ways than their reputation suggested. Plans of sufficient complexity have more failure points. The Alpha Legion's campaigns sometimes collapsed in unexpected ways, precisely because they had become so layered that a single unforeseen variable could cascade through the whole system. Rogel Dawn, another Primarch who was not warm toward Alpharius, made a similar observation. Dawn noted that the Alpha Legion's plans were often unnecessarily complicated, that a simpler solution was available and they avoided it. When asked why, Alpharius reportedly replied that they avoided the simple solution because it would have been too easy. There is something deeply revealing in that response, something that, if you read it generously, sounds like pride, and if you read it less generously, it sounds like a being who has made the journey into darkness so thoroughly that he can no longer locate the light. Section 6. The Cabal, John Grammaticus, and the Choice that Damned a Galaxy. Approximately 2 years before the Horus Heresy erupted into open war, the Alpha Legion was engaged in a compliance campaign on a world called Nurth. It was not a particularly remarkable campaign by the standards of the Great Crusade. A human world that had developed its own culture and identity during the Age of Strife, resisting integration into the Imperium, as many such worlds did. The Alpha Legion was handling it in their characteristic manner, working from the inside rather than simply crushing the world into submission from orbit. But during this campaign, they were approached. The individual who approached them was a man named John Grammaticus. He was, by any standard measure, not a soldier, not a warrior, as not someone who should have been able to get the attention of a Primarch with any serious proposition. He was what the law calls a perpetual, a rare category of human being who possesses the ability to regenerate from even lethal wounds, who cannot permanently die in any conventional sense. He had lived for thousands of years. He had learned things, seen things, and come to serve an organization whose age and reach made even the Imperium seem young. The Cabal was not a human organization. It was an interspecies alliance, anchored by certain ancient Eldar, but including representatives from multiple intelligent races, united by a single purpose. That purpose was the opposition of the force they called the Primordial Annihilator. The Primordial Annihilator. In Warhammer 40K's deeper lore, this is one of the names given to chaos itself, to the collective entity of the warp's destructive intention, to the force that the four ruinous powers together embody and express. But the Cabal had been fighting this enemy for longer than human civilization had existed. They had seen empires rise and fall, they had watched species burn, and after all that time, all that observation, they had arrived at a terrible conclusion. There was no way to defeat chaos conventionally. No army could destroy it. No weapon could kill it. Chaos was not a material threat that could be eliminated by sufficient firepower. It was an existential one. It grew stronger as civilizations grew darker. It fed on violence, on despair, on the particular corruption that came from beings with the capacity for good choosing evil. The more beings made that choice across the galaxy, the stronger the Primordial Annihilator became, the weaker everyone else became. The Cabal believed they had found a solution, and it was, to put it mildly, horrifying. John Grammaticus was given the task of presenting the Cabal's vision to Alpharius and Omegon. What they showed the twin Primarchs was not an argument, or it was not a logical case laid out in words. It was a direct experience of potential futures, a psychic revelation of what the Cabal's accumulated centuries of observation had produced. The acuity, they called it, a vision of what was coming. And what was coming, the Cabal showed them, was a choice. The Horus Heresy was inevitable. The Cabal had seen it coming for years.
Okay, before we keep going, I genuinely think Alpharius is the most underrated Primarch in the entire setting, and I say that as someone who has spent an embarrassing amount of time reading about all of them. Like, Horus gets the big tragic fall arc, Magnus gets the galaxy brain hubris story, Sanguinius gets the noble sacrifice. They all have this clean, emotional shape to them. Alpharius doesn't. His story is messy and unresolved, and honestly a little uncomfortable. Because the question it keeps asking is whether being right about the problem is the same as being right about the solution. And I think that is more interesting than any of the cleaner stories. The tragedy that hits harder for me is not the deaths. It is the fact that the Cabal's prediction about the Imperium's decay came completely true. Every single detail, except the one part that was supposed to make the whole thing worth it. That is the part that stays with me. And that is why I keep going back to this legion. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Horus would fall, would turn against the Emperor, would lead half the Space Marine legions in rebellion against the Imperium. This was not in doubt. What was in doubt was the outcome. If the Emperor won, if the forces of the Imperium held, if the Emperor survived, if Horus was defeated and the heresy was crushed, then the immediate crisis would pass. Humanity would survive. The Imperium would endure. But the Cabal showed Alpharius and Omegon what lay further down that road. They showed them 10,000 years of slow decay, a humanity that had survived the heresy but been scarred by it beyond healing. That's an Imperium that hardened into stagnation and cruelty and fear, that worshipped its emperor as a god because the alternative was despair, that became, over countless generations, exactly the kind of civilization that chaos fed on best. Not because it was actively corrupt, but because it was failing. Because every institution became more rigid, more hollow, more incapable of genuine goodness. And at the end of those 10,000 years, chaos would still be there, waiting, growing, and humanity, as exhausted and diminished, would eventually succumb. The Emperor's victory, the Cabal showed them, was not a solution to the problem of chaos. It was a delay, a very long, very costly delay. But if Horus won, this is where the Cabal's logic became its most brutal and most honest. If Horus won, if the War Master overthrew the Emperor and the Imperium fell, the immediate death toll would be staggering. 2, perhaps 3 generations of human civilization would burn. The galaxy would be racked by catastrophe on a scale too vast to fully imagine. Billions, possibly trillions, of human lives would end. But Horus, the Cabal told them, still had a core of genuine love for humanity buried under the layers of corruption. And the weight of what he had done, the magnitude of the destruction he had caused, would eventually break through the corruption. The last shard of his nobility would drive him to a reckoning with what he had become, and in that reckoning, he would turn all of his terrible power against chaos itself, not just against specific enemies, against the root cause, and in the process, he would destroy himself, and the chaos that had used him would be dragged down with him, and the rest of the galaxy would have a chance to heal. The extinction of humanity, in the Cabal's vision, was the cure for the existential threat of chaos. Kill the host, starve the disease, let the rest of the galaxy live. Alpharius and Omegon were given this choice. Help Horus win. Accept that the species they were created to serve would not survive. Accept that this was, in the Cabal's cold, ancient calculation, the lesser evil. And the twin Primarchs apparently agreed. This is the moment around which all of Alpha Legion lore orbits. This choice. This agreement. Because if you accept it, everything the Alpha Legion does during the heresy becomes legible in a different way. They were not traitors in the conventional sense. They were not beings who had turned against humanity out of ambition or corruption or despair. They were beings who had been shown the future, had believed what they were shown, and had made a calculated decision that the survival of the galaxy required the death of humanity. They were, in the most terrible possible sense, trying to do the right thing. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that the lore acknowledges and that the Alpha Legion themselves seem to eventually reckon with. The Cabal was wrong, not necessarily about what would happen if the Emperor won, Everything the Cabal predicted about the state of the Imperium 10,000 years after the heresy is proven essentially accurate. The 41st Millennium is exactly the kind of dying, stagnant, cruelty-soaked civilization they described. The Cabal got that part right, but they got the Horus part wrong, or they were lied to, or the vision was never entirely reliable to begin with. Because visions of the future are probabilistic, not certain, and the weight of thousands of trillions of individual choices reshapes probability every moment. Horus did not overthrow the Emperor and then turn his grief-stricken wrath on chaos. He was killed on the vengeful spirit. The Emperor died holding Horus, or something close enough to dying that the distinction barely matters. Neither of them turned the tide against chaos in the way the Cabal had promised. Yet the Chaos Gods did not burn with Horus. They are still there in the 41st Millennium. They are more powerful than ever, which means the Alpha Legion's choice was made on the basis of a false prophecy, or a manipulated vision, or a calculation that was right about everything except the one thing that made the calculation matter. How do you live with that? How do you carry the knowledge that you helped tear the galaxy apart for a future that didn't come to pass? And more importantly, how do you decide what to do next? 10,000 years later, when the scenario the Cabal described as the lesser evil has already become the history you're living in. The Alpha Legion, fractured into warbands, scattered across the galaxy, still bearing the name of a Primarch who might be dead, still saying, "I am Alpharius," as both a statement of identity and a declaration that the identity itself doesn't entirely matter anymore. He's still conducting operations that nobody outside the Legion fully understands, has never stopped trying to answer those questions. There are elements within the Legion who believe they genuinely turned to chaos, who have been corrupted by 10,000 years of moral compromise and proximity to the ruinous powers, who are simply dangerous enemies of the Imperium by now. There are elements who still believe in some version of the Cabal's plan, who think that by testing and weakening the Imperium from within, they are performing a service, removing its diseased parts so that something healthier can eventually emerge. There are elements who seem to have no coherent agenda at all, who operate by inertia and Legion habit, conducting infiltrations and deposing leaders and seeding chaos simply because that is what they know how to do. And somewhere in all of this, if the most persistent fan theories are to be given any credence, there may still be a Primarch, or the remaining half of one. But before we get to the question of where Alpharius and Omegon ended up, we need to walk through the heresy itself. Because the decisions they made, the moves they made on the board while the galaxy burned, tell us something important about what was actually going on behind the mask. The twin dynamic. A deeper look. There is another dimension to the twin dynamic that is worth exploring before we move on, and it concerns the nature of what the Alpha Legion became as a result of having two Primarchs rather than one. Most Space Marine legions, at their most functional, were essentially extensions of a single will. The Primarch was not merely a commander. He was the genetic blueprint from which every warrior in the Legion was drawn, the source of the psychic and biological character that made the Legion what it was. The Space Marines of the Blood Angels carried Sanguinius's melancholy nobility in their gene seed, alongside his capacity for transcendent beauty and his proximity to grief. The Space Wolves carried Russ's barely contained wildness, his love of the hunt, his complicated relationship with authority. The gene seed was not just biological material, it was a personality, a set of dispositions, transferred biologically through the Primarch's genetic material to his sons. What does it mean when the genetic source is two people who are also one person? The Alpha Legion's Marines have always had a quality that observers find difficult to pin down. They are, individually, less overtly distinctive than warriors from most other legions. There is no one defining trait, no dominant characteristic that marks every Alpha Legionary as clearly as the Blood Angels' beauty marks them or the Space Wolves' savagery marks them. The Alpha Legion's Marines are adaptable. Best they are whatever the situation requires. They can be scholars or savages, infiltrators or line warriors, diplomats or assassins. shifting between these modes with an ease that other legions' warriors generally cannot match. This adaptability is Alpharius and Omegon's joint legacy, genetically encoded. The gene seed of a legion, led by two beings who had to constantly be each other, who had to blur the line between themselves until the line was undetectable, was produced warriors who had an unusual capacity to blur the lines between what they were and what was needed. There is also the question of what the Alpha Legion Marines were told. Most legions understood their own Primarch's identity clearly. They knew who he was. They had myths and histories about him. They celebrated his virtues and, in some cases, quietly struggled with his failings. The Alpha Legion's warriors were told about the twins' secret on a need-to-know basis that, for most of them, that meant they were told very little. Many Alpha Legion warriors probably went through their entire service during the Great Crusade and into the heresy without fully understanding whether the being giving them orders was Alpharius or Omegon or someone else entirely playing the Primarch role for a particular mission. This creates an interesting psychological dynamic. The ordinary Space Marine in most legions had a clear object of loyalty, a face to serve. But the Alpha Legion's warriors had something different. They had an idea to serve, a purpose whose embodiment was deliberately unclear. When you cannot be certain which of your two Primarchs is in command, when you know that others are also claiming the Primarch's identity as a strategic tool, the Primarch as individual becomes less important than what the Primarch represents. You stop being loyal to a person and start being loyal to a philosophy. This is, in hindsight, both the Alpha Legion's greatest strength and one of its most profound vulnerabilities. An organization loyal to a philosophy, rather than a person, is more resilient to the loss of individual leaders. You cannot behead the Hydra if the body does not depend on any specific head. But an organization that has distributed its loyalty across an idea rather than grounding it in a person is also an organization that can fracture along the fault lines of interpretation. What does the philosophy actually require in this situation? Different warbands with different histories and different experiences and different information about what the original mission was will have different answers. And over 10,000 years, those different answers diverge into essentially different organizations that happen to share a name and a symbol. The Alpha Legion in the 41st Millennium is not one legion. It never fully was. It is dozens, perhaps hundreds, and of organizations that all call themselves the Alpha Legion, that all use the Hydra symbol, that all say, "I am Alpharius," but that have absolutely no consensus about what Alpharius would actually want them to be doing. The name has become a self-replicating idea that persists because the idea is useful, not because the original thinker is still directing its application. Alpharius created an organization that could survive his death because the organization's identity was never dependent on his survival. But in solving the problem of succession, he also dissolved the possibility of unified purpose. Section 7. The Drop Site Massacre, playing both sides in hell. The Horus Heresy announced itself to the wider galaxy with a series of events so brutal and so fundamentally destabilizing that the Imperium was never truly the same after them. As the virus bombing of Istvan III, in which Horus used weapons of mass destruction against his own forces to eliminate any who might remain loyal to the Emperor, was the first declaration. A signal fire of horror that said the War Master was willing to burn his own sons. And then came Istvan V, the Drop Site Massacre. The Emperor's response to the reports of Horus's rebellion was to send a force large enough to end it quickly. 7 legions, split into 2 waves, dispatched to destroy the traitors at their stronghold on the volcanic plains of Istvan V. The first wave was 3 legions, the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders under Vulcan, and the Raven Guard under Corvus Corax. All 3 loyal to the bone, all 3 believing they were the vanguard of a cleansing operation that the second wave would reinforce. The second wave was 4 legions, the word-bearers the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, and the Alpha Legion. And the second wave was already committed to Horus. The first wave descended onto the killing ground and fought the traitor forces with everything they had. Ferrus Manus led the Iron Hands in a spearhead assault that almost reached the lines of the Sons of Horus. The Raven Guard and Salamanders took devastating casualties but held their positions, waiting for the second wave to arrive and complete the encirclement. The battle had been going for hours. But the Loyalist forces were battered but intact. There was still a chance. Then the second wave arrived and turned inward. What happened on the black sands of Istvan V is one of the most gruesome events in a history full of gruesome events. The second wave opened fire on the backs of the warriors they were supposedly reinforcing. Ferrus Manus was killed by Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, dragged down in a duel that the histories record with grief so thick you can feel it in the words. Vulcan went missing, taken prisoner by the Night Haunter. Corax fought his way off the field with a handful of survivors and spent the next 3 months hiding on the planet, hunted by forces that wanted him dead. The Alpha Legion's specific role in this event is documented, if not always clearly. They were present in the second wave. They turned with the others. Alpha Legion forces attacked the Apothecarian stations where the Loyalists' wounded were being treated, striking with surgical precision at the support structures that kept warriors in the fight. Armored vehicles swept around flanks. The Alpha Legion moved as they always moved, not as a hammer but as a net, making sure that the avenues of retreat became killing grounds. But even here, at the most seemingly unambiguous moment of the Alpha Legion's betrayal, there are questions. As because some actions taken during and after Istvan V suggest that not everything was as simple as a straightforward commitment to Horus's cause. The Raven Guard's escape from Istvan V, for instance. Corax was reduced to 3,000 warriors from a legion that had numbered in the tens of thousands. He was being hunted by World Eater's forces that wanted him exterminated. The pursuit was relentless. And then, for reasons that the surviving Raven Guard could not fully explain, certain obstacles that should have been impassable were not. Certain enemies that should have intercepted them didn't. A small Raven Guard naval force under Commander Brananev somehow received guidance that allowed it to reach Istvan V and extract the survivors at the critical moment. The Raven Guard thought this was fortune, desperate coincidence, a prayer answered by a distant emperor. It was the Alpha Legion. Omegon had made a decision. Or Alpharius and Omegon together had made a decision. The Raven Guard would live. Not because the Alpha Legion had gone soft, and not because they were having second thoughts about the Cabal's bargain, but because they needed the Raven Guard to survive. They had intelligence that something valuable was going to come through Corax, and they needed him alive and ambulatory to deliver it. The Cabal had told them. The Raven Guard's Primarch was going to receive something extraordinary from the Emperor himself, something that would have implications far beyond a single legion's rebuilding. And when that happened, the Alpha Legion needed to be positioned to intercept it. So they let Corax live. They actively facilitated his survival while simultaneously fighting his forces in the same battle. Both things were true at once. Both things were serving a larger plan. And this is the Alpha Legion at their most characteristic, and at their most difficult to fully evaluate morally. Every action exists on multiple levels simultaneously. The surface is one thing, the layer beneath is something else, and the question of which layer is the real motivation may not have a clean answer. Section 8. The Raven Guard Infiltration. The Cruelest Gambit. What the Alpha Legion did after Istvan V, in the weeks and months of the Raven Guard's attempted recovery, stands as one of the most audacious and disturbing operations in the history of the Legion's Astartes. The Raven Guard survivors made it to Deliverance, their homeworld, the former prison moon of Lycaeus. Corax, still bleeding from the wounds of the massacre, went immediately to Terra to seek the Emperor's counsel. He was a Primarch whose legion had been shattered in a single day. He needed resources, gene seed, warriors, anything that could help him rebuild. And the Emperor gave him something remarkable. A sample of pure Primarch genetic material. A key to accelerated creation of Raven Guard Astartes. A scientific breakthrough that could allow the shattered legion to replenish its numbers in years, rather than the decades such rebuilding would normally require. Corax returned to Deliverance with this prize and began the process of rebuilding. The new warriors, created through the accelerated process, were extraordinary, stronger, faster, as more capable than standard Space Marines. They were called Raptors, and within weeks, Corax had hundreds of them coming through the creation process. He did not know that he had never been alone. Omegon had positioned himself on Kievar, the forge world that Deliverance orbited. He had operatives in place, had established contacts with the remnants of the old technological guilds that had once controlled Kievar's industry before the Imperium absorbed them. He had Alpha Legion warriors surgically modified to look like specific dead Raven Guard warriors, their faces grafted with the features of loyalists who had died on Istvan V. These doubles were inserted into the surviving Raven Guard at the first available opportunity during the chaos of the recovery period, when faces were unfamiliar and records were incomplete, and everyone was operating in grief and urgency. Think about what this required. Well, the Alpha Legion's apothecaries performing detailed reconstructive surgery on their own warriors to give them the exact faces of dead enemies. Warriors trained to inhabit the mannerisms, speech patterns, and personal histories of specific individuals. Months or years of preparation for an infiltration that would last only as long as necessary to serve its purpose. The infiltrators worked their way into the Raven Guard's rebuilt ranks. They observed, they collected data. And when the moment was right, when Corax's lab was producing the accelerated gene sequence at full capacity, they acted. Omegon personally led the climactic phase of the operation, coordinating his forces on Kievar, while his infiltrators worked from within Deliverance's fortifications. A rebel uprising on Kievar, manipulated by Alpha Legion agents, drew Raven Guard forces down to the surface, thinning the defenses of the Raven Guard's gene labs. In the resulting confusion, an Alpha Legion operative struck at the heart of what Corax had built. They stole the Primarch gene sequence, the actual, verified working template that the Emperor himself had provided. They also did something else, something far crueler. They introduced a mutagen into the remaining samples, a viral agent designed to corrupt the gene sequence at a level subtle enough to not be immediately apparent. The raptors that would continue to be created from the remaining material would develop mutations. But not chaos corruption in the spiritual sense, but physical abnormalities, scales, horns, physical distortions that marked the afflicted warriors as wrong in some fundamental way. And then Omegon delivered what he had stolen to Alpharius, and Alpharius delivered it to Horus. Except that what he delivered to Horus was not the real gene sequence. It was a copy, incomplete, largely useless for any serious application. The Alpha Legion kept the real one for themselves. But this is the detail that cuts deepest, I think, when you contemplate what the Alpha Legion actually was. Even in service to Horus, even in the midst of a plan supposedly designed to ensure Horus's ultimate victory, so that humanity could be consumed and chaos defeated, they were still taking something for themselves, still keeping the advantage they needed to stay ahead of everyone else, still playing the long game that nobody else knew they were playing. After the Raven Guard eventually identified the infiltrators, the Alpha Legion operatives were purged. The corrupted raptors were allowed to continue serving despite their mutations, a decision that says a great deal about Corax's complicated mercy. The gene labs were shut down. The accelerated rebuilding program ended, meaning the Raven Guard would never regain the numbers they might have had. The effects of this single operation cascaded for years. The Raven Guard spent the rest of the heresy as a shadow of what they had been, conducting the kind of hit-and-run operations that were their specialty, but never able to bring the weight they would have brought if Corax's rebuilding had succeeded. Every battle where the Raven Guard were too few to turn the tide, every moment where their absence cost the Loyalists something precious, can be traced back to what Omegon and his operatives accomplished in the aftermath of Istvan V. And somewhere in the calculation the Alpha Legion made, this was all intentional. Whether you call it serving Horus's cause, serving the Cabal's cause, or serving the Alpha Legion's own inscrutable cause, the effect was the same. The Loyalist side was weakened, the war would be longer, more would die, all according to the plan, whichever plan that was. Section 9. The Battle of Pluto, the Death of a God, the Solar War. The period in the latter years of the Horus heresy when the traitor forces, having ground down loyalist resistance across the galaxy, finally turned their full attention toward Terra itself, toward the home system of humanity, toward the world where the Emperor sat in his palace, extending his psychic power across the stars to maintain the Astronomicon, the lighthouse that made warp travel possible, while simultaneously burning himself down from within with efforts that nobody on Terra fully understood. The Alpha Legion was given a specific role in the opening campaign of the Solar War. Their assignment was essentially what they had always been best at: create chaos, confuse the defenders, plant so many simultaneous crises that the Imperial Fists, who held the Sol System's defense under Rogel Dawn, could not respond effectively to any of them. The plan they executed was extraordinary in its scope and patience. Sleeper cells. Alpharius had spent years before the heresy even erupted into open war, placing operatives throughout the Sol system. Not just on Terra, throughout the system, on moons, on orbital platforms, aboard civilian ships, embedded in support organizations that had never had any reason to suspect infiltration. These were not newly arrived agents. They had been there for years, living their cover identities, doing mundane work, building the kind of trust that only time can establish. When the time came, these cells were activated, and the effect was staggering. A freighter was detonated in Terra's atmosphere, raining debris and death across populated areas and killing millions. The Damocles starport suffered catastrophic damage in a series of coordinated attacks. Triton erupted in rebellion, a coordinated uprising that demanded military response. And a cell of Alpha Legion warriors who had been stored in literal stasis since before the heresy began, planted years earlier in the depths of the Imperial Palace's infrastructure, awoke and began conducting operations in the most secure location in the galaxy. Rogel Dawn, who was not given to panic under any circumstances, was suddenly facing a galaxy of simultaneous emergencies in the one place he was supposed to have locked down completely. The most fortified human installation in history, and agents of the enemy were waking up inside it. But this was all a distraction, orchestrated chaos to draw Dawn's attention away from the real objective. Pluto, the outermost guardian of the solar system's defense network, the location of the primary astropathic monitoring station, the installation that allowed Terra to receive and process communications from across the Imperium, that allowed Dawn to understand what was happening in the broader war. That formed the single most critical node in the Loyalists' intelligence network for the entire Sol system. If Pluto fell, Dawn would be blind. And a blind defender, no matter how strong his walls, could not hold against an enemy that could coordinate attacks on every front simultaneously. Alpharius's plan for reaching Pluto was, even by Alpha Legion standards, an act of extraordinary patience. He put his entire fleet into stasis, every crew member, every warrior. And the ships themselves were powered down to the absolute minimum required to maintain life support, their heat signatures reduced to almost nothing. And then the fleet was put on a course for Sol, and drifted there, for an entire year. No warp travel, no emissions that would show up on Imperial sensors. Just metal and silence and frozen warriors drifting at minimum speed through the dark between the stars. In arriving at the edge of Terra's defenses, essentially invisible because nothing alive generates that little heat, and nothing threatening should be moving that slowly. The fleet reached Pluto, more than 200 vessels. The assault on the moon of Hydra, the critical astropathic installation, began. The Imperial Fists garrison fought back with everything they had. First Captain Sigismund and his Templars, already among the most formidable warriors in the Imperium, threw themselves into the defense. Alpharius's Lernean Terminators and his Headhunter squads pushed into the installation itself, carving through the defenders toward the communication arrays. And Alpharius himself was there, not directing from the flagship. On the ground, fighting, the twist, the thing that makes the Battle of Pluto one of the most discussed engagements in the entire heresy. Alpharius had been using a technique he had apparently developed to an extraordinary degree. Yet he had actually taken on the identity of one of his own headhunters, a commander named Kel Salonius. He had had his own memories suppressed, had been inserted into the system as Salonius, had fought the early stages of the battle as Salonius, with psychic triggers in place to unlock his true identity at the critical moment. When Rogel Dawn arrived at Pluto aboard the Phalanx, and having performed a brilliant slingshot maneuver around the Sol system's gravity wells that brought him to the battle with a speed that should not have been possible, and teleported directly to the surface of Hydra to find Alpharius himself conducting the assault, the Alpha Legion Primarch's memories came flooding back. The two Primarchs faced each other. What happened in the chamber on Hydra is documented with unusual specificity for an event involving the Alpha Legion. So Alpharius tried to reason with Dawn. He told him he was not doing this for Horus. He told him he was doing it for the future, that Dawn needed to understand the real nature of the war, that there was a context beyond the simple loyalty versus treachery framing that Dawn had lived his entire life within, that both of them cared about the future of humanity, that they needed to talk. Dawn did not talk. Dawn fought. The duel was devastating. Alpharius was faster, more agile, wielding the pale spear, a weapon of alien make, with properties that made it extraordinarily lethal to even Primarch-grade targets. He dealt Dawn wound after wound, using his speed advantage to stay out of Dawn's crushing range, exploiting every opening. But Dawn was not simply a warrior. He was a student of fortification, of defense, of the ways that pressure points in a system could be found and exploited. And he had watched Alpharius fight. He had watched the way Alpharius moved. It had noted the patterns, had absorbed the rhythm of the duel in the way that Dawn absorbed everything, with the stone patience of a Primarch who built walls because he understood that the most important thing about a wall was knowing where its weak point was. The dying Arcamus, Dawn's master of the Huskars, saw the moment Alpharius was about to deliver what should have been a killing blow. He tried to intervene, to protect his Primarch, throwing himself at the spear even in his last moments. And Arcamus, in his dying action, believed that he had failed, that his intervention had barely slowed the blow. What he didn't know was that Dawn had seen the blow coming. Arcamus's desperate charge was meant to be a distraction, and Dawn had already committed to a counter. The same move, reportedly, that he had used decades earlier against a particularly enormous Orc warlord. A technique so specific to a particular combat situation that Alpharius, as despite all his intelligence and all his tactical acuity, had not modeled for it. Alpharius did not die immediately. There was a moment, the sources suggest, of something between disbelief and acknowledgement. The Alpha Legion Primarch, who had always operated from the position of knowing more than anyone else in the room, found himself in a situation he had not fully anticipated. His own complexity addiction, the compulsion to make every plan more intricate than it needed to be, had contributed to this. He had been looking for the sophisticated counter from Dawn. The simple one found him first. Alpharius died on the moon of Hydra at the hands of Rogel Dawn in the opening shots of the Solar War. Or one of them did, because the other was somewhere else. Omegon was commanding different forces, playing a different role, had perhaps been aware of what was happening on Hydra in real time through whatever psychic connection the twin Primarchs maintained. And when his twin died, Omegon experienced something that the sources describe with appropriate weight, a grief so total and so disorienting that it was almost incapacitating. The Alpha Legion, without a living Primarch for the first time in their existence, faced the prospect of becoming exactly what the Hydra symbolism promised they would never be. A creature that could be beheaded. Omegon became Alpharius. He had to. The plan required it. The Legion required it. And perhaps, and in some deep sense, that goes back to the question of whether they truly shared one soul. Omegon was the only being in existence who could fill that role without it being a lie. But it changed things. It had to change things. Note also what Dawn did after the battle. He kept the death secret. He did not announce that Alpharius had been killed. The official position was ambiguous, unclear, designed not to provoke the Alpha Legion into a fury that might have undesirable consequences. Dawn, the bluntly honest Primarch who prided himself on his directness, chose deception when dealing with the master deceivers. That, too, says something about Alpharius's legacy. Even in death, he had trained his enemies to respond to him in ways they would never have chosen for anyone else. Section 10. Escrador. The second death. Or was it? The Horus heresy ended with Horus dead and the Emperor broken. What had been a galaxy-spanning war collapsed into the question of what came after. Or many of the traitor legions retreated into the Eye of Terror, into the warp-saturated regions where chaos held sway, to lick their wounds and plan for a return that has been building for 10,000 years and shows no sign of stopping. The Alpha Legion did not go to the Eye of Terror. This, by itself, is a significant divergence from the standard traitor playbook. The Eye of Terror was a refuge. It was also, from the Alpha Legion's perspective, probably a trap. A place where your freedom of movement was constrained by the geography of the warp, where time moved strangely and unpredictably, where chaos cults and demon princes surrounded you on all sides, where the corruption that came from proximity to the ruinous powers was essentially impossible to avoid over long enough exposure. The Alpha Legion chose instead to move, to spread, to go in the direction they had always been philosophically inclined toward, the galactic east, toward regions that were still turbulent in the aftermath of the heresy, toward, specifically, the territory of the Ultramarines. Whether this was the surviving Primarch's decision, Omegon, who had become Alpharius, is one of the questions the sources leave genuinely open. But the fact of it fits a certain psychological profile. Alpharius had spent his career trying to prove something to Guilliman, had spent years being dismissed by the Ultramarines Primarch as fundamentally inferior, as a practitioner of a lesser form of war. Even with the galaxy on fire and the heresy over and everything changed, that rivalry had not resolved. It had just been interrupted. On the world of Escrador, the Alpha Legion met the Ultramarines in battle. The full details of what happened are, of course, disputed, but the broad shape of it is recorded from multiple angles with sufficient consistency that we can reconstruct something approaching what actually occurred. What the Alpha Legion expected Guilliman to fight the way Guilliman always fought. By the Codex. By the book that Guilliman himself was in the process of writing. The systematic, documented, thoroughly analyzed, and optimized approach to space marine warfare. They prepared for a battle where the Ultramarines would follow predictable deployment patterns, would advance in carefully documented formations, would engage at angles and distances that their doctrine specified as optimal. As it was a reasonable assumption. It was the assumption you would make about a warrior scholar whose entire identity was built around the idea that correct procedure was the highest military virtue. Guilliman had spent the heresy watching the Alpha Legion. He had seen what happened when you fought them the way they expected to be fought. He had seen the adaptability, the endless contingencies, the plans that dissolved one form only to reconstitute in another. Yet he had come to a conclusion that was somewhat uncomfortable for the creator of the Codex Astartes. Against the Alpha Legion, the book was a liability. So he abandoned the book. Guilliman split his forces in a way that his own doctrine would have regarded as reckless, keeping the majority of the Ultramarine force engaged in the main battle, while personally leading a smaller, elite strike force in a rapid assault on the Alpha Legion's command position. It was the kind of improvised, a situation-dependent tactic that the Codex explicitly cautioned against. It was what the moment required. The strike caught the Alpha Legion entirely off guard. The surviving Primarch, whichever twin it was, faced Guilliman personally. The duel was brief by the standards of Primarch combat. Reboot Guilliman, with all his superhuman strength and speed, and the enormous gauntlets of Ultramar burning on his hands, overwhelmed the Alpha Legion's Primarch. The Primarch fell, died, but by Guilliman's account. And then something happened that Guilliman had not prepared for, because it was something that should not have been possible. The Alpha Legion having just watched their Primarch die, did not break. Every military tradition in history, whether human or otherwise, operates on the assumption that killing the leader ends the fight. Leadership is the morale center of an army. The death of a Primarch should have been the end of the Alpha Legion's engagement on Escrador. Well, that was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The Alpha Legion held, and then, a day later, they attacked, coordinated, disciplined, using prepared positions and pre-planned contingencies that had apparently been set up before the battle began. Contingencies that accounted for the possibility of the Primarch's death in the field, and were designed to continue the operation without missing a beat. The Ultramarines, who had just killed the Alpha Legion's Primarch and were expecting this to be over, suddenly found themselves on the defensive against a force that was fighting as though nothing significant had happened. It was the Hydra. You cut off one head, two grow back. Guilliman, after days of brutal fighting and significant casualties among his strike force, eventually gave up hope of a clean victory and ordered orbital bombardment. The Alpha Legion's position on Escrador was burned from space. As Guilliman left, he had won, in the technical sense that the enemy's primary force had been destroyed. He claimed the death of the Primarch as a confirmed kill, but the Ultramarines have never fully believed that account. Not really. Within their own records, the death of the Alpha Legion's Primarch at Escrador is listed as believed killed and status unconfirmed, because the Alpha Legion's response, the orderly continuation of the campaign after their supposed Primarch's death, was so perfectly consistent with the possibility that whoever died on Escrador was not the real Primarch at all, but a body double, a decoy, playing the role that the situation required. Had there been two Primarchs, and Dawn killed one on Pluto, then who died on Escrador? The logical answer was the surviving twin. But the Alpha Legion has, in the millennia since, demonstrated a capacity to continue exactly as they were before Escrador, which raises the question of whether anyone actually died, or whether the death of the Primarch was itself the plan. A final gambit to make the Ultramarines think they had won, to buy the Legion's centuries of relative quiet while they rebuilt and rerouted across the galaxy. The fact that word reached the High Lords of Terra at some point after the heresy's end of a Chaos Lord claiming to be Alpharius conducting raids on the moons of the Denevra subsector does not help clarify things. Was this the genuine article, a surviving twin, an impersonator using the name as a recruitment tool, a Legion warband maintaining the fiction of a living Primarch to sustain morale? Nobody knows. And the Alpha Legion has never told anyone. Section 11. The Legion that never dies. 10,000 years in the shadows. 10,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time when you try to hold it in a human context. 1,000 generations, civilizations rising and falling, languages evolving beyond recognition, every biological human lineage turning over dozens of times. And throughout those 10,000 years, the Alpha Legion has never stopped. Unlike the other traitor legions, who have spent this time largely in the Eye of Terror, marinating in chaos corruption, emerging periodically to launch the Black Crusades that have defined the 41st Millennium's recurring nightmare, the Alpha Legion spread itself across the material universe. It lives in the cracks of the Imperium. It is, in some sense, everywhere and nowhere, which is exactly how Alpharius would have wanted it. The Legion's gene seed is one of the most discussed mysteries in this context. Normal Chaos Space Marine gene seed, after 10,000 years of exposure to warp energy and the moral corruption of Chaos service, degrades. It mutates. It expresses increasingly unstable biological phenomena. Most of the traitor legions are marked by their gene seed's deviation from the Emperor's original template. And maintaining stable numbers is difficult or impossible without access to clean progenoid material. The Alpha Legion's gene seed has remained, by all available evidence, unusually stable. Imperial observers who have managed to obtain samples, which is difficult by definition, note that the Alpha Legion's biological template shows less degradation than any other traitor legion. This has led to two main theories, neither of which is fully confirmed. The first theory is that the Alpha Legion's unusual stability is a function of their limited time in the Eye of Terror. Warp exposure corrupts gene seed. If you spend less time in the warp, your gene seed degrades more slowly. The Alpha Legion's decision to operate in the material universe rather than sheltering in chaos-controlled space may be, among other things, a deliberate strategy for preservation. The second theory is darker and more interesting. The Alpha Legion, during the Heresy, stole the Primarch genetic template that the Emperor had given to Corax, the real one that they kept for themselves while giving Horus a useless copy. They also had access to the Raven Guard's gene sequence and the techniques used to create the Raptors. With these resources, and with centuries and then millennia of refinement, the Alpha Legion may have developed the capacity to produce new Space Marines at a rate and with a quality of gene seed that no other Chaos organization can match. They have been recruiting into their ranks continually, generation after generation, replacing losses, maintaining and actually growing their numbers in ways that should be impossible for a legion cut off from the Imperium's gene seed infrastructure. This would mean the Alpha Legion that fights in the 41st Millennium is not, in the strictest genetic sense, purely descended from the original 20th Legion warriors. It is something more complex. And a legion that has been continuously rebuilding itself, incorporating new gene seed material, selecting for the traits and capabilities that the Legion's philosophy demands. Not a frozen remnant of the 31st Millennium's war, but something that has continued to evolve. The Alpha Legion in the 41st Millennium operates in war bands that are nominally independent of one another. There is no central command, and no supreme Harrowmaster who directs all operations from a single point of authority. Each warband operates with its own agenda, its own interpretation of what the Legion's purpose is, its own answer to the question of whose side they are actually on. The warbands represent a spectrum that should, honestly, not exist within a single organization. At one end, there are bands that have genuinely turned to chaos, that have allowed corruption to take root over the millennia, and that fight for the ruinous powers, with conviction, if not always with unity. These warbands are dangerous, effective enemies of the Imperium, who simply happen to use more sophisticated infiltration and misdirection tactics than the average Chaos Force. At the other end, there are warbands that seem to be, by every observable indicator, still working towards something that looks less like Chaos service and more like the original Cabal mission. It's now repurposed in ways the Cabal itself might not have intended. These warbands test the Imperium. They destroy what they identify as corrupt or weak, not to bring the Imperium down, but to remove the parts that are no longer serving any useful purpose. They infiltrate organizations, not to sabotage them, but to redirect them. They are, in the most twisted possible sense, still trying to help, still trying to serve a future that the Cabal showed them, and even though the Cabal's version of that future is long dead. And then there are the warbands in the middle, the majority probably, who have lost the thread of the original purpose and are operating on Legion instinct and institutional habit. They infiltrate because the Legion has always infiltrated. They deceive because deception is what Alpha Legionaries do. They maintain the fiction of Alpharius because the name still means something, still draws warriors to the banner, or still produces a certain kind of fearful respect in enemies who have done enough research to understand what it represents. The name, I am Alpharius, is still used, still said with the specific weight that it carries, the implication that the speaker could be the actual Primarch, or could be a warrior invoking the shared identity, or could be something else entirely. It still functions as a declaration of philosophy, as a weapon, as a statement that in this army, the individual is not the point. And certain notable Alpha Legion figures from the 41st Millennium lore have stood out for the clarity of their divergence from the usual ambiguity. Occam the Untrue is a warband leader who believes that the Alpha Legion's purpose is to test and strengthen the Imperium from within, to be the immune system that destroys the parts of the body that are failing before they can corrupt the rest. He is, by most definitions, still loyal to something that resembles the Emperor's original vision, even while fighting against the Imperium as an institution. He is one of the more fascinating examples of what 10,000 years of the Alpha Legion's ideological drift has produced. There is also the figure of Omegon himself, or at least the question of Omegon. In the 41st Millennium, there are references in the lore to ongoing searches for the surviving Primarch. Occam, notably, and had information suggesting that the Necrons, specifically the Satan known as the Deceiver, had some knowledge of Omegon's whereabouts. The Deceiver had apparently used the bait of pretending to have Omegon in order to lure in an Inquisitor, which tells you something both about how much people want to find Omegon and about how effectively the Alpha Legion's mysteries can be used as tools even by third parties with no connection to the Legion. The Pale Spear. Alpharius's personal weapon during the heresy has also made appearances in the 41st Millennium's lore. A Harrowmaster named Solomon Akura obtained most of it, which adds another layer to the ongoing question of whether the Primarch is truly gone or whether weapons left behind are waiting to be reclaimed. None of this resolves anything. It is not meant to. The Alpha Legion exists in a state of perpetual ambiguity because that ambiguity is functional. An organization that can never be fully understood cannot be effectively countered. An organization whose loyalty is permanently in question cannot be trusted by any side, which means it can always position itself as potentially useful to every side. And that utility is leverage, and leverage is power. The Inquisition has invested extraordinary resources in trying to penetrate and understand the Alpha Legion over the millennia. The results have been, by inquisitorial standards, deeply unsatisfying. Every source they develop within the Legion is potentially a deliberate plant designed to feed them misinformation. Every conclusion they reach about the Legion's true purpose might be the conclusion the Legion wants them to reach. The famous Kraven incident, in which the Inquisitor Kraven provided what appeared to be the most comprehensive account of Alpha Legion history ever compiled, ended with the discovery that Kraven had almost certainly been compromised by the Legion, making his entire account suspect. But suspect in which direction? Were his pro-Legion conclusions planted to make the Inquisition underestimate the threat? Or were his more damning conclusions planted to make the Inquisition overinvest resources in a direction the Legion needed scrutiny applied? Nobody knows. Nobody who has tried to find out has ever come away with certainty. Section 12. The unanswerable question. What does it all mean? Let me bring you back to where we started. The question I asked at the very beginning, the one I told you to sit with before we dove in. Who is Alpharius? We have spent a very long time in the weeds of this story now. We have traced the twin Primarchs from their origins as scattered gene seeds of the Emperor's ambition, through their different formative experiences in the galaxy's dark corners, through their reunion and their hidden partnership, through the heresy and its terrible choices, as through two deaths that may or may not be real deaths, through 10,000 years of shadow operations and fractured purpose, and the slow, grinding question of whether any of it was worth it. And I want to be honest with you. We still cannot answer the question cleanly. That is not a failure of research or a gap in available information. It is a structural feature of who Alpharius is. The question cannot be answered because Alpharius was designed, at the deepest level, to be unanswerable. But the twins made themselves into a philosophical position as much as a person or a pair of persons. They chose to exist as a principle rather than as individuals. And principles are harder to kill than people, harder to understand than people, and much harder to clearly evaluate. What we can do is look at the question from several angles and notice what each angle illuminates. From the angle of intention, if you take the Cabal's bargain at face value, if you accept that Alpharius and Omegon genuinely believed the vision they were shown, and genuinely chose what they believed was the lesser evil, then Alpharius was, in a twisted and terrible way, one of the most morally serious beings in the entire history of the Imperium. He looked at the information available to him, made the best calculation he could, and acted on it, even though that action meant betraying everything he was supposed to be loyal to, because he believed the survival of the galaxy required it. That is not the act of a selfish being. It is not the act of someone who turned traitor, because the traitor side offered better rewards, or because corruption found a weakness in his soul. It is the act of someone who looked at two terrible options and chose the one he thought was less terrible. The fact that he was wrong, that the Cabal's vision did not come to pass, does not automatically make the choice a failure of character. People can make the right decision with the information they have and still get a bad outcome. The moral weight of a decision is measured by the quality of the reasoning, not by the wisdom of hindsight. From the angle of method, whatever Alpharius's intentions were, the methods the Alpha Legion used were objectively and measurably harmful to millions, possibly billions, of human beings over the course of the heresy and in the 10,000 years that followed. That the infiltration of the Raven Guard destroyed a legion that should have been able to rebuild. The operations during the Solar War killed millions on Terra alone. The ongoing operations in the 41st Millennium, even from the warbands that consider themselves to be serving some kind of higher purpose, cause suffering and death on a scale that is difficult to contextualize. The utilitarian argument that the Cabal presented, that short-term suffering on a large scale might prevent existential suffering on an even larger scale, is the kind of argument that is very seductive in theory and absolutely monstrous in practice when you are one of the people in the short-term column. The millions who died in the Solar War's opening attacks, the attacks that the Alpha Legion orchestrated as diversions, did not get to hear the Cabal's vision before they died. But they did not get to vote on whether their lives were acceptable collateral damage in a gamble against a future catastrophe. This tension between the scale of the purpose and the humanity of the cost is one that the Alpha Legion's story never resolves. It is not meant to resolve. It is the question at the center of the Hydra's coiled body, asked in a universe where every answer has a body count. From the angle of legacy, what did Alpharius actually leave behind? And not in the immediate sense of the Alpha Legion as an organization, but in terms of what his existence says about the nature of the Primarch's project, and about what happens when beings of extraordinary capability are given purposes that their emotional and psychological architecture was never fully prepared for. The Primarchs were made to be generals, made to inspire and to lead and to destroy the Emperor's enemies. They were not made to make choices about the survival of species, were not given the philosophical framework to hold those choices without being broken by them, were not taught to ask whether the Emperor's own mission was correctly understood. Most of them never had to ask those questions, because most of them had clear enemies and clear purposes and the moral architecture to sustain their certainty. Alpharius was different from the moment he arrived in the galaxy's narrative. He was the Primarch who was hidden, whose existence was the secret, and whose value lay precisely in the fact that he could not be what the other Primarchs were. And that difference, that permanent outsider status within a brotherhood of supposed equals, that training in the arts of never being what you appear to be, made him uniquely susceptible to the kind of terrible clarity the Cabal offered. He had never had the comfort of simple loyalty. He had always been serving a purpose that was not entirely legible even to himself. The Cabal just gave that complexity a name and a goal. From the angle of the 41st Millennium, here is perhaps the most interesting observation of all. The scenario that the Cabal predicted as the lesser evil outcome, the one in which the Emperor wins and the Imperium slowly decays over 10,000 years, is the one that actually came to pass, and it is, unambiguously, terrible. The 41st Millennium is the stagnant, cruelty-soaked, or despair-generating civilization the Cabal described. It is exactly the kind of civilization that feeds chaos, rather than starving it. The forces of chaos are more powerful in the 41st Millennium than they were in the 31st. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, the wound across the galaxy that has plunged half the Imperium into isolation and chaos, is a material fact of the current era. The warp storms are worse. The demon incursions are more frequent. The corruption spreads faster and deeper into institutions that were once capable of resisting it. The Cabal was right about the outcome. They were wrong about the solution. Which means that the Alpha Legion, 10,000 years later, is in the position of an organization that chose the wrong path for the right reasons, that has watched the prediction that drove their choice come true in every respect except the one that would have made the choice worth making, and that has no good options left. But the war they were supposed to help end is not ending. The species they were supposed to help consume itself into victory is still here, still suffering, still being slowly eaten by the darkness. What do you do with that? Some perhaps have stopped asking the question and simply continued doing what they know how to do. Some have apparently doubled down on the original logic, as if 10,000 years of failure is just a delay in the plan, rather than evidence that the plan was wrong. And some have found new purposes, smaller and more human purposes, the protection of specific things rather than the transformation of galactic history. And some, if the most persistent theories are even partially right, may still be working from a much longer timeline than anyone outside the Legion can comprehend. A 10,000-year plan that has not yet reached its critical juncture. A Primarch who did not actually die and is still watching, still waiting, or still not revealing himself until the moment the plan requires it. I am Alpharius. The phrase has been spoken by warriors dying in battle, by Primarchs in their final moments, by operatives maintaining covers for decades, by warbands rallying around a name that might be the name of a dead man, by characters in novels who claim the identity as a philosophical statement rather than a biographical one. Every time it is spoken, it carries the same weight, or the weight of a decision made in darkness about what was necessary, and the weight of the uncertainty that follows you when you act on imperfect information in service of a perfect ideal. Alpharius was the most mysterious Primarch in Warhammer 40K, not because the records were lost or the history was incomplete, but because the mystery was the point. Because a being who can never be fully known can never be fully countered. It's because a legion that is never entirely one thing is a legion that can never be entirely destroyed. The Hydra's heads keep growing, somewhere in the dark beyond the Cicatrix Maledictum. Somewhere in the inquisitorial archives where classified reports about an operative who said, "I am Alpharius," and couldn't be placed. Somewhere in the galaxy's margin where a warband conducts operations that don't quite fit the pattern of either loyal Imperial servant or committed Chaos devotee. The question is still being asked. And Alpharius, whoever he is, wherever he is, however many of him there currently are, is probably very pleased that you haven't figured it out yet. Closing, the legacy of the question. So let us bring this to its final rest, or as close to a final rest as any conversation about the Alpha Legion can have, which is to say, not entirely restful, and possibly a setup for something you haven't anticipated yet. Alpharius Omegon is the most mysterious Primarch in Warhammer 40K's history, not by accident, not by narrative convenience, but by deliberate design at every level. The people who created the universe built ambiguity into the Alpha Legion's foundation explicitly, because the ambiguity serves the kind of story the universe wants to tell. A story about moral complexity in the face of cosmic horror, about the limits of knowledge and the danger of certainty, and about what happens when you are given a choice between two terrible options, and choose the one that seems less terrible, and then have to live with the choice in a world that did not become the world you chose for. The Alpha Legion endures in the 41st millennium because they adapted to endurance. They did not chain themselves to a chaos god whose patronage would give them short-term power and long-term corruption. Whilst they did not retreat into a warp bubble where time moved strangely and the galaxy outside became increasingly irrelevant, they stayed, they spread, they became part of the fabric of a galaxy that they were nominally trying to tear apart, and in doing so, they became very difficult to remove from it. They are the reminder that the Imperium has enemies it does not understand, and that the enemies it does not understand are the ones that should frighten it most. Yet not because they are more powerful than chaos in the conventional sense, but because they cannot be categorized, cannot be clearly opposed, cannot be described as simply evil without immediately generating the counterexample that complicates the description. The Alpha Legion might be chaos worshippers, They might be secret loyalists. They might be something that has evolved beyond either of those categories over 10,000 years of operating without clear guidance in a galaxy that keeps not becoming what their founding prophets promised. They might be the answer to a question that nobody thought to ask yet. They might be Alpharius, and so might you. If you made it through this entire journey, this deep dive into the most deliberately confusing corner of Warhammer 40K lore, I genuinely appreciate you staying with it, as this is the kind of story that rewards the patience you brought to it. If you found something in here that clicked for you, something you hadn't considered before about Alpharius and Omegon, and what their story actually means in the broader context of the 40K universe, drop it in the comments. Tell me what theory you are currently holding. Tell me which version of the Alpha Legion you believe in. Tell me who you think died on Pluto and who died on Escrador, if anyone did. And if you have not yet subscribed to Q on 40K, this would be an excellent moment to do it. We go deep on this universe. We take the lore seriously, and we will keep coming back to the questions that do not have clean answers, because those are the ones that make this setting what it is. I will see you in the next one. Hydra Dominatus, the expansion. A. Insert after one soul in two bodies section, after the because the Cabal is the key paragraph. There is another dimension to the twin dynamic that is worth exploring before we move on, and it concerns the nature of what the Alpha Legion became as a result of having two Primarchs rather than one. Most Space Marine legions, at their most functional, were essentially extensions of a single will. The Primarch was not merely a commander. He was the genetic blueprint from which every warrior in the Legion was drawn, the source of the psychic and biological character that made the Legion what it was. The Space Marines of the Blood Angels carried Sanguinius's melancholy nobility in their gene seed, alongside his capacity for transcendent beauty and his proximity to grief. The Space Wolves carried Russ's barely contained wildness, his love of the hunt, his complicated relationship with authority. The gene seed was not just biological material. It was a personality, a set of dispositions, transferred biologically through the Primarch's genetic material to his sons. What does it mean when the genetic source is two people who are also one person? The Alpha Legion's Marines have always had a quality that observers find difficult to pin down. They are, individually, less overtly distinctive than warriors from most other legions. There is no one defining trait, no dominant characteristic that marks every Alpha Legionary as clearly as the Blood Angels' beauty marks them, or the Space Wolves' savagery marks them. The Alpha Legion's Marines are adaptable. They are whatever the situation requires. They can be scholars or savages, infiltrators or line warriors, diplomats or assassins, shifting between these modes with an ease that other Legion's warriors generally cannot match. This adaptability is Alpharius and Omegon's joint legacy, genetically encoded. The gene seed of a Legion led by two beings who had to constantly be each other, who had to blur the line between themselves until the line was undetectable, produced warriors who had an unusual capacity to blur the lines between what they were and what was needed. There is also the question of what the Alpha Legion Marines were told. Most legions understood their own Primarch's identity clearly. They knew who he was. They had myths and histories about him. They celebrated his virtues and, in some cases, quietly struggled with his failings. The Alpha Legion's warriors were told about the twin secret on a need-to-know basis that, for most of them, meant they were told very little. Many Alpha Legion warriors probably went through their entire service during the Great Crusade and into the heresy without fully understanding whether the being giving them orders was Alpharius or Omegon, or someone else entirely playing the Primarch role for a particular mission. This creates an interesting psychological dynamic. The ordinary Space Marine in most legions had a clear object of loyalty, a face to serve. The Alpha Legion's warriors had something different. They had an idea to serve, a purpose whose embodiment was deliberately unclear. When you cannot be certain which of your two Primarchs is in command, when you know that others are also claiming the Primarch's identity as a strategic tool, or the Primarch as individual becomes less important than what the Primarch represents. You stop being loyal to a person and start being loyal to a philosophy. This is, in hindsight, both the Alpha Legion's greatest strength and one of its most profound vulnerabilities. An organization loyal to a philosophy rather than a person is more resilient to the loss of individual leaders. You cannot behead the Hydra if the body does not depend on any specific head. But an organization that has distributed its loyalty across an idea rather than grounding it in a person is also an organization that can fracture along the fault lines of interpretation. What does the philosophy actually require in this situation? Different warbands with different histories and different experiences and different information about what the original mission was will have different answers. And over 10,000 years, those different answers diverge into essentially different organizations that happen to share a name and a symbol. The Alpha Legion in the 41st millennium is not one legion. It never fully was. It is dozens, perhaps hundreds of organizations that all call themselves the Alpha Legion, that all use the Hydra symbol, that all say, "I am Alpharius," but that have absolutely no consensus about what Alpharius would actually want them to be doing. And the name has become a meme in the deepest sense of that word, a self-replicating idea that persists because the idea is useful, not because the original thinker is still directing its application. Alpharius created an organization that could survive his death because the organization's identity was never dependent on his survival. But in solving the problem of succession, he also dissolved the possibility of unified purpose. The legion he built to endure has endured. Or whether it has endured as anything coherent is a much harder question. Expansion B. Insert near end of the Cabal section, after Horus paragraph. Let me elaborate on why the Cabal's argument was so compelling to beings of Alpharius and Omegon's particular psychology, because I think this is important for understanding the decision rather than just cataloguing it. The Cabal's offer, if we can call it that, was essentially the perfect pitch for two beings who had always lived in the gap between what they appeared to be and what they actually were. Alpharius and Omegon's entire existence had been defined by the principle that surface reality was not to be trusted, that the real meaning of events was always somewhere below the visible layer, accessible only to those patient and clever enough to look for it. The Cabal was offering them access to the ultimate version of that hidden layer, and not just tactical intelligence or strategic foreknowledge, but metaphysical truth, the actual structure of how the galaxy worked, the way that chaos as a force fed and grew and could eventually be defeated. They were being invited into a perspective so elevated above ordinary understanding that the Emperor himself, by implication, did not see what they were being shown. For beings who had always been the ones who knew more than everyone around them, this was intoxicating. But for beings who had been defined by their relationship to secrets, being offered the grandest secret in the history of sentient life was an almost irresistible appeal to their deepest nature. And there is another layer, darker and more human. Alpharius and Omegon had spent their entire existence being used. The Emperor had used Alpharius as a covert instrument while celebrating Horus. The alien Slough had literally used Omegon as a resource. Yet the entire history of their lives was the history of beings whose extraordinary nature made them targets for exploitation. The Cabal was, in a sense, offering them something they had never fully had, a purpose they had chosen rather than been assigned, a mission that they were undertaking because they believed in it, not because some authority above them had determined they were suited for it. There is a tragedy in that framing. The choice that looks most like genuine agency, yet the choice to take the Cabal's bargain and work toward the defeat of chaos, is the choice that ultimately serves someone else's agenda. The Cabal needed the Alpha Legion. The Cabal approached the Alpha Legion specifically because the Cabal needed someone to do what the Alpha Legion was uniquely positioned to do, which was to operate effectively on the traitor side without genuinely becoming traitors. The Cabal was using them too. Was that obvious to Alpharius and Omegon at the time? Probably. Yet they were too intelligent not to see it. But perhaps they decided that being used in service of a purpose they had independently examined and found worthy was categorically different from being used in service of someone else's unexamined agenda. And perhaps they were right about that distinction. even if they were wrong about the ultimate outcome. The Cabal, notably, did not survive the heresy in any recognizable form. John Grammaticus, the human perpetual who had delivered their message, eventually turned against the Cabal's logic. He came to believe that the cost of the Cabal's solution was too high, that the extinction of humanity was not acceptable, even if it was theoretically optimal. He made different choices, helped different people, worked against the consequences of the very plan he had helped set in motion. Whether he was right or wrong about that is a question the lore leaves beautifully unresolved, which is appropriate for a universe whose central premise is that there are no good solutions, only choices between different kinds of terrible. Expansion C. Insert after. Section 7. The Drop Site Massacre. Add to the White Scars section. There is one more action during the heresy that deserves attention as an illustration of the Alpha Legion's internal contradictions. As the episode with the White Scars that shows how the twin Primarchs had already started to diverge, even in their shared mission. The White Scars under Jagatai Khan had been isolated in the Kondak system, engaged in a campaign against alien forces far from the main theater of the heresy. Horus's plan had been to keep them isolated, to prevent them from learning what was happening elsewhere in the galaxy, and to give them time to be recruited to the traitor cause, or at minimum neutralized as a loyalist force. The Alpha Legion was assigned to enforce this isolation. Their fleet blockaded the exits from the Kondak system using communications jamming technology, specifically a pylon array, to prevent any news from reaching the White Scars about the broader war. It was Omegon who decided to destroy his own legion's pylon array. Let that sink in for a moment. Omegon sent a force, designated as a suicide mission because the array was too well defended for the operatives to survive destroying it, to eliminate the very installation that was keeping the White Scars in ignorance. By destroying it, he allowed communications to flow again. And the first major communication that reached Jagatai Khan through the now open channel was a message from Rogel Dawn, warning of Horus's betrayal. Omegon gave the White Scars the information that brought them back to the loyalist cause. But this was not what Horus wanted. This was not what the Cabal had asked for. The Cabal wanted Horus to win quickly and decisively. A White Scars force joining the loyalist side was a meaningful boost to the side that was supposed to lose. If Omegon was genuinely committed to the Cabal's plan, destroying that pylon array was a mistake at best and a betrayal of the mission at worst. Unless Omegon had already started to question the mission. Unless the death and destruction he had witnessed in the months since the heresy began had started to erode the cold calculation that had seemed sustainable in the abstract. Unless the twin Primarchs, described as one soul in two bodies, were not quite as unified as they presented themselves to be. The Alpha Legion's subsequent behavior toward the White Scars in the region adds another confusing layer. After seemingly facilitating the White Scars' alignment with the Loyalists, Alpha Legion forces apparently engaged them in combat anyway, maintaining the appearance of blockade even as the information was out, provoking hostilities in ways that kept Jagatai's forces occupied and prevented them from moving to join the broader Loyalist cause immediately. What was this? A hedge? A recognition that the mission required the appearance of Horus loyalty even as the substance was being quietly sabotaged? Or a sign that the left hand of the Alpha Legion, the Omegon half, genuinely was working at cross purposes to the Alpharius half, the twins who shared a soul finding the shared soul, starting to pull in two different directions as the weight of their choice became real. This is one of the moments that makes the most compelling case for the theory that the Alpha Legion, even at the highest level of command, was never fully unified. That the twins looked at the same situation and sometimes drew different conclusions. That what looks like a single coherent strategy might actually be the result of two similar but not identical minds running parallel processes that occasionally produced contradictory outputs. And if that was true of the Primarchs, it becomes far more understandable why the Legion they led has fragmented into so many different philosophical interpretations of their shared mission. Expansion D. Insert in Section 11. the Legion that never dies, and expand the warband section. Some specific examples of the Alpha Legion's operations in the 41st Millennium help illustrate just how far the Legion's interpretations of purpose have diverged. The Siege of Vrax, for instance, one of the most protracted and destructive Imperial military campaigns of the 41st Millennium, lasting decades and consuming millions of lives from both sides. What the Alpha Legion's involvement in the siege has been analysed extensively by Imperial scholars who have tried to understand exactly whose side the Alpha Legion was on in that conflict. The answer appears to be complicated.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.